Hey, aloha, everybody, and welcome to the Four Habits of Powerful Teaching and Learning, the neuroscience behind effective instruction. And here in Module 2, that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on, the cognitive neuroscience. So, there's a lot of ways to think about instruction. One of the things we've been doing as a Berkeley was trying to simplify it. And one of the things we looked at to help simplify what effective instruction is was the neuroscience behind it. And as it turns out, if you've taken some of the other classes, or if you take all four of them, you'll see that one of the things that we do is our brain is focused on wanting to be safe. And another thing is it wants to be interested in what it's learning. And then today and in this module, we're going to be talking about what does the brain, why does talking help the brain so much? And then of course the brain wants to use pictures. We're going to really zero in on, what's the big deal about student talk or talk time or talking to learn? So we've got a copy of the rubric. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at that. And again, we're looking at talk to learn, the blue, and over in the third column, and we'll explore that just a little bit. And we've worked our way up to this. We started at the bottom and we went with ready to learn and what to learn and now talk to learn. And we've now entered into a new realm. That new realm is Bloom's taxonomy. So we're going to explore the idea now that the brain feels safe to learn and it knows what to learn. How do we go about learning? How does talking help us learn? So we're going to be looking at elaborative rehearsal. This idea of elaborative rehearsal. So I'm going to explore that here in just a few minutes and describe what that is and give you a couple of examples. But the bottom line is it's question and discussion. And if for those that are paying attention to the Danielson evaluation model, it's just 3B. It has to do with higher order questions, kids explaining their reasoning to peers, and coming up with some of your own questions. So this is definitely an area that we have been exposed to before. The big question is, as we go through this, does the science make sense? And then as we move forward in the module, are our habits aligned with that science? So, our learning targets in this module, as we move forward with Talk to Learn, I want you to be thinking about three things. I mentioned just a minute ago that we like to try to keep things simple. Well, as you go through this entire module of Talk to Learn, and actually even the whole course, really all Talk to Learn is us thinking about the types of questions we ask, how we have students explain their reasoning, and do we have that do we have them do that to peers? And then how often do we have the students initiating their own learning, not just responding to questions, but initiating their own learning? So as we go through this, I want you to be thinking about your own classroom, but really there's not that much to think about. It's just how are our questions? Who do we have kids explain things to? And do we ever have them initiate their own learning? Now, as we look at the neuroscience, I just want you to see why those three things are so important. So as we go forward, we're going to be talking about talk to learn, which has, as we saw, it has to do with question and discussion. We will look at the neuroscience behind it. We're going to make some connections to the Four Habits rubric, and then we're also going to, you'll be seeing that you'll be asked to, in this module, to make some connections to your own instructional habits. Now, as I'm going to give you a tagline for the talk to learn, but now remember in ready to learn, when we were talking about amygdala management, we said stressed brains do not learn very well. In what to learn, when we're talking about learning targets, we said that the brain does not pay attention to boring things. Well, now with talk to learn, we have a new catchphrase. And that is when we start talking about the students learning, if they didn't say it, then they didn't save it. And so you're going to be learning more and more about the hippocampus here. In the other classes, we were talking about the amygdala a lot. The reason we want the amygdala to be calm and we want to manage the amygdala is so we can get information through the hippocampus into short-term and long-term memory. So a great way to do that is to get kids to talk. And so in this module and in this presentation, we'll talk about how that helps and why that helps. The term that we are using to guide all this is elaborative rehearsal. Basically, it means this: we are talking our way into short-term and long-term memory. Our goal is to store information in the brain and then retrieve information from the brain. And the more places that we can store it, then the more places we can retrieve it from. And so as we go through this, When we talk about elaborative rehearsal, we're not talking about just memorizing words, although that is a form of rehearsal for sure. We're talking about how can we have kids talk, and how can we have them rehearse their learning in an elaborative way so that it actually stores information in many parts of the brain rather than just one part of our brain. I want you to be thinking about this. If we're talking about learning, think about it as storage and retrieval. And as we get into talk to learn, the reason we're going to be going into all of these three elements that are on the rubric is because it helps us develop multiple storage sites. So the idea behind this is the more places you can store something, the easier it is to retrieve it. I was thinking about Amazon. If Amazon only had one distribution center in the world, we'd still order stuff. We'd still probably eventually get it for the most part, but it wouldn't be very efficient. And maybe the stuff would get lost. So the fact that there are multiple distribution sites all over the world allow people to get something that they order in the morning, they can get it by 4 p.m. that day. It's crazy. But it's because of multiple distribution centers. So what we want to do is talk about this idea of we're going to talk about our questioning here in a minute. Recall questions are not bad. It's just that there's fewer connections in the brain. When we ask a recall question, when we have kids just memorize things for the sake of memorizing them, and we're not making any connections, we're not having them explain their thinking, we're not elaborating, then there are few storage sites. It stores in a few places, and it becomes more difficult to retrieve. But hot questions, higher order thinking questions, when we ask higher order thinking and we're making connections to other learning and even bringing in our own schema, now we're starting to create many storage locations and retrieval options. So as we get into this and we're starting to talk about higher order thinking questions, really what we're trying to do in all these cases and all three things we're about to talk about is we're trying to establish multiple distribution centers. We're going to store the information in a lot of places so it can be sent out and retrieved from multiple locations. So, as we think about storage and retrieval, and we think about talk to learn, at its core, all we're saying is the more we talk, the more storage locations we create. And higher order questions lead to more talk. If we were to just ask lower level questions or recall questions or even copy things, really the brain isn't working very hard and it's not storing it in very many locations. But the more we talk about it, the more we explain our reasoning about something, we explain our connections to something, we talk about prior learning even, the more places it will end up being stored. So the more we talk, the more storage locations we create. So let's talk about this, the storage locations. There's three things we're going to talk about. Remember, questioning, uh, students explaining their reasoning, and then them initiating their own. So we're going to start with hot questions, higher order thinking. A lot of you are probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, but there are others out there, including Qualmalt's and others. But the bottom line is, down at the bottom of the pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy is this idea of recall or remembering things. Now, if I were to ask you when was the War of 1812, you'll go in and retrieve that. It's like, oh, probably around 1812. And then, well, tell me more about that. It was around 1812. The problem with recall level questions is we kind of just know them because we know them. We stored it in that one spot. But when we get to understanding and applying and analyzing level questions, these higher levels of questions, then now what starts to happen is we create other connections to it. And so the big idea behind hot questions, higher order thinking questions is it leads to more discussion, which leads to more storage locations, which leads to more retrieval options. And so as we look at Bloom's taxonomy from remembering all the way up to creating, really what we're doing is we're just saying, let's do something beyond just recall, something beyond just memory. I actually like this Bloom's taxonomy picture. If it were left up to me, I'd put all five of those. I'd put remembering on the bottom like it is, and I'd put the other five all equal across. It really is just, as you look at the rubric here in a little bit, really the big issue is it just recall, which is going to be in columns 1 and 2, Or is it something more than that? It's a higher order or an open-ended type of a question that we're trying to apply it to our own lives in some way. That's going to be we're going to call that the hot question, higher order thinking question or prompt or task. Some schools are using Avid or depth of knowledge and that kind of thing, and even have some language around that and some sentence stems and word starters and that kind of thing. Very, very helpful. That's what we're talking about. The more we can use these higher level of thinking questions, just the more we have to say about it. All right, so that's why are there hot questions? Why do we do higher order thinking questions? Next is processing with peers. You're going to see in the rubric that we're really trying to have students explain their reasoning, and Common Core 8 Standards of Mathematical Practices calls us to do this. ELA pedagogical shifts, a big focus in next gen science is the same thing. Why is it that everybody's saying let's explain our thinking to our peers? Why not just explain to the teacher? Well, the bottom line is when we want to have all the students talking as much as possible, and there's only one of you, then everybody kind of has to just wait in line. It's just a bottleneck. It's just really a math thing. When all of the answers, all the question and answers have to go through the teacher, then students can't talk as much. And so this whole idea of processing with peers, or this idea of think, pair, share, you're going to see that in the rubrics, the second bullet. And one of the things I encourage people to do is if we want students to say something, have an opportunity to talk, let's have them in pairs as often as possible, and then let's get them to say it, and then let's have them square up and maybe into a small group and then say it, and then maybe stand up and do some sort of a rotation exercise where they share it with somebody new, and then we can talk about it as a whole class as we wrap up. So for me, as we think about this whole idea of talk to learn, really what we're doing is we're saying, where are the opportunities for students to talk to as many people as possible, so that we can process the information? Because the more times we hear ourselves talk and explaining our reasoning, why I thought that was a good claim, why I think the evidence is good evidence for that claim, not just sharing answers with each other, but explaining our reasoning. Okay, so the more often we do that, the more we can move the information through the hippocampus and into long-term memory, because that's our goal. If we want students to learn it, try to get them to say it. So think of all the different ways for online and in person in the classroom teaching, all the ways we can get students to talk to, the whole idea of think, pair, share is first I'll talk to myself, I'll write it down, I'll think, and then I'm going to pair up and then maybe square up and we're going to share. So, and if we really want some students to learn something, let's try to get them to say it as many times as possible. That's why I really like the pair up, square up, stand up, wrap up. So the more people, the more opportunity. Just like the higher level the question, the more things we have to say about it. The more people, the more opportunity we have to talk. So the more people we can talk to, the greater chance we have of talking more. And again, I mentioned we can, as we start to think about our own habits, how often do we have students pair up? How often do we have them square up? How often do we have them stand up? And then how do we have them wrap up? So we're just trying to get to know the research behind it. If we want students to learn something, let's give them a question or a prompt or a task that has a lot of connections and a lot of ways to talk about it. And let's also give them an opportunity to talk to lots of people about it. The more they talk, the more they'll move the information through the hippocampus into long-term memory. The more people, the more opportunity. I don't think those other bulbs are going to light like that. I think that there's something wrong with that picture a little bit, but I like the idea. We can light each other up. Next one has to do with initiating our own learning. Picture of the brain cracks me up. Oh, those are some great tennis shoes. Anyway, so and a lot of times in school, we are giving information to students. We're having them memorize it in a lot of cases, or they'll read something and they'll give that information back to us. But number one, we want to try to develop higher order questions so that they can answer questions and then explain their reasoning. But the third thing here now is The brain actually really loves to work out of the frontal lobe. The brain actually loves heavy lifting. It's hard to recall information that's just stored in one spot or just a few spots in your brain. The more places it's located, the brain loves that. And by the way, the brain actually really loves to create things. That's what it does. It doesn't just store information; it uses stored information. So as we're moving forward with this, another way to really help students their brains grow and help them learn is to get them to talk about their own questions that they have, initiating their own learning. What hypothesis, what ideas, what kinds of things are going on in their mind? So rather than just having students answer questions, now we're going to do that. We will always do that in school. But in addition to students answering our questions, we can make sure that we're focusing on having them generate their own ideas and questions. So as we look at the rubric here, you're going to see lots of things about higher order questions, kids explaining their reasoning, but also coming up with some of their own ideas. And as we get into the learning walks and the lesson planning later on in other modules, the goal will be to really take a really close look at our own habits and plan out to make sure all these things are happening. For right now, we're just hoping to make sure that you see the impact on the brain. If we could talk about our own ideas, our own hypotheses, that kind of thing, the brain really likes to do that. So, if we were just, in fact, just as if this works as an example, if I were to ask you, what do you know about the four habits? Your brain will function in a certain way. It'll go in and it'll try to find that information and then recall it, retrieve it, and then say something about it. What do you know about the four habits of powerful teaching and learning? If I were to ask you the question, what is a question you have about the four habits of powerful teaching and learning? Now your brain has to go in and say, well, first of all, what do I know about it? And what do I not know about it? And what would I like to know about it? It ends up putting us into a KWL. What do I know? What do I want to know? And then we can record what we've learned. So to ask students to actually generate their own ideas is a great way to help them learn even more. Have them talk about what they're interested in, what they'd like to learn, what their questions are. So if they didn't say it, they didn't save it. And as we start, we're going to look at the rubric here briefly. The hot questions, we talk about higher order thinking questions. That's just so we have more to talk about as we're moving information, sneaking it past the hippocampus or past the amygdala and, and into the hippocampus and into long-term memory. We're just asking higher order questions, so there's more places, more things to say about it, more places for it to be stored. And then peers, we're going to be explaining to peers so that we have more people to talk to. And then we're going to have them initiate their own learning so they have more personal schemas to connect with. So as we talk about our own connections and have our own, we have to come up with our own things that we're interested in. We're connecting it to our own schema, which is stored all through our brain as well. So we're going to be looking at simply question and discussion. Like I mentioned before, this is Danielson 3B, and I know you're familiar with it. So we talked about hot questions, processing with peers, and initiating your own learning. And in the midst of this is really creating what we try to focus on here is student learning community, student-centered learning, and say it to save it is our little slogan. So as we're moving forward and looking at question and discussion, and we have the whole rubric, and we always start in the third column, and so that's what we're going to do here. Third column of talk to learn. I just want to read to you. I want to make those connections to the rubric, and then we'll be wrapping things up here as far as content in module 2, at least this content. So connections to the 4 habits rubric. We just went over the research. Now listen to the rubric. Teachers provide higher order open-ended prompts, tasks, or questions. I just wanted to make sure that the science makes sense as we're moving forward here. Second thing is students explain their responses and their reasoning to peers. They have more to say and they have more people to say it to. And then finally, students generate their own ideas or hypotheses, questions. They may be critiquing and coming up with ideas or looking at feedback. Maybe they give themselves feedback. Maybe they give somebody else feedback. Or maybe they're looking at success criteria and determining what somebody could do differently next time. So, or what they themselves could do next time. So the idea behind these three bullets, as you look at these in the four habits, as you look at talk to learn, is these three things help our brain store information in multiple locations, which gives us more options for retrieval. As you get into it, and I hope you'll take a closer look at the rubric now that you see where we're at with the third column on talk to learn. You're going to see with hot questions that there's three big ideas there. There's try to go beyond recall. It's a higher order question, thinking questions. Try to be thinking about open-ended prompts related to student learning community. How we're wanting to make sure that students process information with their peers. In a later module, we're going to talk about why that pair share is so important. Explaining their reasoning, not just memorizing answers or sharing answers, but explaining their reasoning. We want the kids to elaborate and discuss, all so they can be storing information in multiple locations and for easier and better retrieval. And then finally, initiating their own learning. Remember, the brain likes heavy lifting. Generating their own ideas, critiquing and feedback, generate and use success criteria. So, as we're moving forward here, wanted to make sure you understood the research behind it and why the rubric is worded the way it is, and we'll certainly be using that in later modules. So, today, our learning target for today was to be thinking about, first of all, to understand the idea that elaborative rehearsal comes from higher order questions and explaining our thinking and initiating our own questions and learning. So our goal today was to be thinking about those three things as we're moving forward. We wanted to learn about the neuroscience. We wanted to make some connections to the rubric itself, and then we also want to make some connections to ourselves. So you'll continue to do that as you go through this module 2. Hope you have a great time. Hope you're learning lots. Make sure that you're responding to the questions on Canvas, and then of course at the end of this module, at the end of module 2, respond to your reflection questions in your portfolio, and then upload those before you move on to module 3. Well, hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully you enjoyed it and it makes sense to you. And we're really looking forward to seeing you online.